Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Steph, what's going on? What's going on?
Nothing much, really. I am dealing with the consequences of my actions. So, you know how... So I got my husband's car, I tricked out his ride, I pimped his ride. And since then, I have, of course, been enjoying driving it. So I like to drive it sometimes, especially when I'm going grocery shopping because he has an SUV. Mm-hmm. Well, yesterday I was driving it and I got into an accident.
Oh, no. Oh, my God. Was it a bad accident? Were you good? What's up?
What's crazy is that, so I was making a right-hand turn and somebody else was making, it was like one of those rolling turns that you can make. Mm-hmm. And so they started rolling. I started rolling, but they stopped suddenly. And so it was a tap in the back of their truck. But child, when I looked at the front of the car, the bumper falling off is...
Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, man.
Child, oh, my God. I was just so upset. Like,
yeah, I bet.
Damn. So, yeah.
Dang. That sucks.
I'm gonna take it to the shop tomorrow. I was like, I'm gonna take responsibility because the car literally drove off. Like they didn't even stop. And so I was trying to catch up with them.
Oh,
yeah.
So they didn't even stop for to settle the dispute.
Nope. They literally drove off.
Did they even know you hit them? Was it?
I don't know, because it, like I said, it was really light, and it was a truck too. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is, I don't think anything happened to theirs. They had one of those little, I guess, where you can attach things to the back of the truck. Okay, yeah. So that's what my car hit, and that's what caused the most damage. So I guess nothing happened to theirs because literally it was so light. They might not have even felt it.
Yeah, probably not. Them pickup trucks, man, them things are doable. When I got my first accident, my joint was totaled. That car just had a little scratch. A little truck, a couple scratches. No dents, no nothing. So I'm sure that car was fine. But yeah, that sucks, man.
Yeah, so I'm sad. I got to take it to the shop tomorrow. I was like, I take responsibility. I'm going to pay for it. Because it was just a gift to him. So I can't make him pay for a car that I messed up and I had just pimped out. So.
Dang. Well, I wish I had better news, but my week has been interesting too.
What happened?
No, I mean, nothing much. Just a lot of bad news this week. One, we went to the Beyonce Jay-Z concert. So that was fun, but we went on Thursday and we had the longest rain delay because of thunderstorms. So the concert was supposed to start at 8 p.m. Like they did, the couple the opening acts. And then, everybody's ready. Beyonce supposed to come on next. We're like, what happened? Next thing you know, police officers get on stage, listen to everybody. You got thunderstorms, so we need everybody to kind of evacuate, yada, yada, yada. That concert didn't wind up starting until 11:15.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
We didn't get out till 1:30. I mean, they did the whole show. Credit to them. They did the whole show. But it was late. So it was kind of weird because everybody was hype in the beginning. But as the later it got, it was I was sitting down, chilling. So it was still fun. Then the next day, me and Chris ordered a new couch. So the people were supposed to come in to measure, see, to get the couch in. They come in talking about the couch won't fit. And we really wanted we really, really wanted that couch, man. So we were really disappointed in that. So now we got to go back couch hunting again. And then finally, we were supposed to be going to Chicago this weekend for Kristen's grandfather's 90th birthday. I was having a big dinner. But we couldn't go because on Friday they canceled all the flights.
What?
Canceled all the flights. Yes. Because it was supposed to be a thunderstorm and it didn't even rain.
Oh my God.
So mad. Then the flights they had that we could book to try to get there on time, it was like a little lunch birthday dinner thing. And we wouldn't be able to get into like 11 p.m. the next day.
And that's so sad. That's such a special occasion.
I know. I'm so upset. So I'm like, goodness, man, could anything just go right this week? So yeah, I feel you. It just wasn't a good week for BHD, huh?
No, it wasn't. But hopefully it'll look up. I'll have an update for y'all next week.
Yeah. Hopefully we got some better news coming in next week. We will prevail. So I guess that's our own personal Oh Lord news of the week. I guess we can get into some real Oh Lord news about what's been going on.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
Hello, and welcome to BHD News, where we give you the most current and eye-opening Oh Lord news of the week. Join us as we present news that'll make you want to say,
So, speaking of Chicago, I actually came across a very disturbing video last night. It was a truck, kind of like an 18-wheeler that carries like freight stuff. Come to find out, and there were a bunch of police officers in front of it, and they are being confronted by some guys in a Chicago neighborhood because what the police officers did was park a 18-wheeler, have it wide open with Jordans filled in the truck, and they parked it right in front of like a basketball court where like some young Black people were enjoying themselves and not thinking about committing any crimes. And so what they were doing was trying to bait people into stealing Jordans so they could arrest them. Wow. It's crazy. Like, can
that's
they
crazy.
Enjoy their day? Like, are you that hard up for arrests that you need to try to like trap people into committing crimes? Like, you can't fight the real crime out there?
I feel like that got to be some form of entrapment. Like, that can't be legal. And like, why would you do that? Like, oh my God, man, that's crazy.
And what really pissed me off is because what I loved was that these young men were confronting these police officers. And one of the young men was like, I bet you wouldn't do that in your neighborhood. And guess what the police officer said?
What'd he say?
He was like, no, they wouldn't. It never would have been done. But let's talk about the shoes.
Wow. Mad disrespectful, man. That's crazy. Definitely.
So crazy. And I'm just really not comfortable with that. Like, there's plenty of crime in Chicago. Fight the real crime instead of trying to like trap people who might see a crime of opportunity, which happens across all race. So like, I don't want to hear well, they shouldn't be stealing. Honey, people take advantage of crimes of opportunity. Don't try to trap people that ain't doing wrong. So.
Trust me, any teenage boys, that would be an appealing situation. Whether you somewhere else, whether you're in the suburbs, whether you're not in the suburbs, come on now.
Yeah.
And then that's crazy. Okay.
Yeah. So the other story, I want to talk about your president. So you heard about LeBron James opening up this school. Shout out to him.
Shout out to LeBron. Free
tuition, free uniforms, free bicycles, free transportation, free breakfast, free tuition to University of Akron, GED placement services for parents. So he had an interview with Don Lemon a couple days ago. Your president then gets online and is like, LeBron James was just interviewed by the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do. I like Mike. The hell?
Yo, like, oh my goodness, man. What is this guy doing? That really, I'm not, I'm kind of used to a lot of Trump's antics now, but that one really like irritated me in a lot of ways. I'm like, LeBron is out here doing something amazing for his community and just talking about it in an interview. And then why are you going to go here and like try to destroy this positive thing that he's doing? Like, and they call him and then disrespect him by calling him stupid. Both of them.
Yes, both of them. Like, these are way more intelligent than you. I mean, you can't even form like complete sentences sometimes, but like that's neither here nor there. But like actually doing something positive, you'll hear Republicans talking about like, oh, you shouldn't depend on the government, like, and stuff like that. Well, this is somebody who is like doing something outside of the government, doing way more than a lot of public schools are even doing for their kids. And this is the criticism. And I mean, Trump wasn't the only one. There were like really weird and lame tweets from people that was like, can my kid take part? Oh, wait, he's white. So the answer is no.
Oh, my God.
And another person was like, even white kids, LeBron? How about conservative kids? Apparently not. You're a dummy. First of all, it's for kids that live in his neighborhood. It's
That's disrespectful, man. I never saw, just somebody doing something so positive like that. And then people just trying to just mess it up and talk trash about it. It's crazy. It's President of the United States, man. This is what we got. This is what we're working with.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Anyway.
Yeah. And this final thing it might not exactly be oh Lord news, but it was related to our topic for today. So I was just like, I guess it's something that we can think about.
Yep.
So there was recently, Rihanna is on the cover of British Vogue for September. And the way her makeup is done, she has like these pencil thin eyebrows. And a Latina writer penned an article accusing Rihanna or raising a question of whether Rihanna was appropriating chola or like Mexican like gang. It's like the eyebrows that like female members of like Mexican they have a gang affiliation. They call them chola eyebrows. And so like she pens this article and was like, if I were to do this as a Latina woman, I'd be, people say that I was in a gang. They say like all of these bad things about me. But when Rihanna is doing it on the cover of Vogue, she's praised as this like fashion icon. So, I just thought that was an interesting article, especially given today's topic. I wasn't really sure how much I bought it because the author herself was like, historical figures like Josephine Baker, who is a Black performer from the 1920s, had these eyebrows. This was like more of like 1920s flapper culture. And I thought that was the vibe of Rihanna's cover or spread. So I don't know, but I thought it was interesting because that's kind of what we're asking today. Who can appropriate? And, what does appropriation mean?
Yep, the big question. This is what today's topic is about. And that's a good segue into it because we see this a lot of times in these situations when celebrities or whomever are wearing certain hairstyles or wearing certain clothes or doing certain things. And people are like, hey, is this appropriating? Is it not? Singing certain songs, right? And we're trying to figure that out. A lot of times, it is appropriating. People don't understand what it is. Maybe it's not appropriating. And I think it's important because we do see that a lot of times when we do talk about appropriation, it's, the question is, can at least say if a white person like Kim Kardashian is wearing something called Bo Derek braids and contribute to her own and not attributing it to, Black folk who've been wearing this style, since the beginning of time. But then, you can hear the vice versa. Will do black folk appropriate white people and white culture, right? And is that possible? And a lot of conversations go along with that. And we address that in today's conversation with our guests, Dr. Tamara Brown, Dr. David Terry, and Dr. Diarra Robertson, who all were a part of this book, wrote in this book, chapters in this book called Soul Thieves. And so we'll be talking about their contributions in that book. And they each talk about different aspects of appropriation, from music and hip hop to comic books to dance. So really, really interesting conversations. And I think, you all gained some valuable insights about appropriation from it. It was a really good time talking to them too.
Yes, I agree.
All right, so
let's get started.
Yeah, without further ado, let's get it going. Catch up with y'all afterwards. Cultural appropriation has been a hot topic in recent years. Debates about cultural appropriation often center around questions related to what it means to appropriate another's culture and whether we can apply the term to Black Americans and other people of color. Today, we tackle this topic through multiple lenses by interviewing Professors Tamara Brown, Diarra Robertson, and David Terry. Welcome, professors. Before we start getting into the content, talking about cultural appropriation, we just always like to ask our guests to just tell us a little bit about yourselves, a little bit of background about yourself, and kind of why you study what you study.
Okay, so hi, I'm Tamara Brown. I am an associate professor of history and director of women's studies at Bowie State University. It's real interesting how I have come to this place. I have a love for the performing arts and a love for history. And I didn't know how I was going to be able to marry the two of those. And my undergraduate degree is not in history. I do have a minor in dance, but I don't have an undergraduate degree in history. But when I was in graduate school, I was doing research for my master's degree on Catherine Dunham. So I was finding a way to look at the performing arts and dance specifically in a scholarly way. And I just gave into my love for history and went over to the history department for my PhD. And I met one David Terry there.
Sure. My name's David Terry. I teach history at Morgan State University in Baltimore. I also coordinate their master's program in museum studies and historical preservation. As an historian, I'm mainly interested in U.S. history. I focus principally on Southern history, especially the history of the urban South for the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. I'm interested in the ideas and the theories with which we grapple with the idea of how Blacks navigated the Jim Crow world, particularly what we have come to call the world within the world, so to speak. Interested how Black people saw themselves, the resources that they were able to create for themselves to craft the resistance that they did craft. In terms of what I contributed to this book, it was a blending of sorts of my natural curiosity and the fact that I grew up a child of the 70s as something of a comic book nerd. The histories of the civil rights and Black resistance in the 60s are plentiful. So I, as a person who is only secondarily interested in the decade, was looking for a different entry point. So the idea of comics as a cultural artifact is a way to try to grapple with how people perceive their moment and where that moment might be leading them was interesting to me. So,
okay, my name is Diarra Robertson. I'm associate professor of government at Bowie State University and currently the chair of the department. My interests overlap with my primary interest was Black politics. And during my dissertation research, I looked into the focus partially on the Black Power movement, specifically the role of culture and the Black arts movement overlapping with the Black Power movement, which led me to study people like Amiri Baraka and a few other cultural figures during the 1970s and late 60s. So that, and I consider myself a big fan of music, so that kind of led to my interest in Dr. Brown's project.
It's so awesome when you can take your passions, your interests, and turn them into a career. I think we say that every time, but it's just so awesome and fascinating how the work comes together, the research comes together, and it's usually something that is personal in nature. So thank you for sharing. So this conversation is about cultural appropriation. And we were just wondering if you could actually define it. Like, what is cultural appropriation and why should we be discussing it?
Right. Appropriation, it's funny because when I am just talking to just everyday people and things like that. And they're asking me about my work and that type of stuff. And I'll say, oh, so-and-so and so, you know, appropriation, blah, blah, blah. And they always look at me and they say, oh, stealing. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's a form of theft. It's the idea of taking somebody else's culture, and it's the dominant group taking from a marginalized or an oppressed group, and they usually don't have permission. They typically have little respect or knowledge about the culture from which they are appropriating. And they're just like a whole lot of nuances, et cetera, that go into that when you're talking about appropriating. And the big thing in it is the fact that it's a hierarchical relationship, and that you have a dominant group, often with money and the resources to take and define something from that marginalized or oppressed group.
So what is the difference? Because I've heard also cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. What are the differences that our listeners should know between the two terms?
Well, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, kind of, and I put that kind of there on purpose. I always say that there's a very thin line between appropriation and appreciation. I remember one of the Supreme Court justices, like when they were talking about pornography, said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I kind of look at it the same way. I can just give you like some personal opinions that I have, and then maybe my two colleagues might have an example that they would like to share as well. I can think of somebody like a Tina Marie, okay, in music history versus an Eminem. Now, people can say, well, you know, what's the difference? And all I can say is it's a personal difference. I like Tina Marie. I liked her music. Her circumstances were very similar in that Rick James was the person who, you know, was able to promote her as part of, you know, part of his group and things like that, and help to promote her solo career. And this is in forms of appropriation. You often have some member of that group that helps to introduce the entity, you know, into that culture. And then with Eminem, you have Dr. Dre, you know, who's responsible for him. But I don't know, Tina Marie doesn't get on my nerves. Eminem does. That's, you know, that's the easiest way that I can say it. I think it also has to do with, you know, where hip hop came from and things like that versus, and I don't want to, you know, fans of R&B don't get on me, but, you know, versus R&B that does have that blue-eyed soul element in it. But I think I was watching an episode of Unsung, and they were doing Tina Marie, and one of the commentators on the episode said, well, Black people liked Tina Marie because she knew her audience was a Black audience, and she wasn't trying to pander to a mainstream audience, and they respected her for that. Now, I don't know, you know, that could well be true, but like I said, it's sometimes a very thin line, and it's often in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Dr. Brown. It's a relative sort of consideration, and I think appropriation versus appreciation often stem from the same place, often involve the same actors, often take up the same sort of content and contexts. Cultural appropriation is an exercise of power. It's It's an ability of the empowered to claim primacy, to claim voice, to claim definitional authority over, quote unquote, the other. And with resistance struggles, appropriation speaks mainly to areas of conflicts and strategies, timetables, tactics, outcomes. When power is at play and people aren't speaking for themselves, those who are at the center, those who are the community, if they don't have the capacity to define their place, to define their direction, if the cost of the assistance of other people is to surrender authority, then you have appreciation becoming appropriation.
Well, so it's really interesting that you say that, and I'm happy you talked about power, because cultural appropriation is a term that's used often now. Black Twitter, they kind of go in, and I'll see kind of rebuttals to arguments about cultural appropriation where they're like, Black people do it too. Mm-hmm. And so I really appreciate you talking about the role that power plays in appreciation versus appropriation. And it actually gets into our next question, because while I was reading some of the articles, specifically the So You Think You Can Dance or chapter, So You Think You Can Dance, it actually made me think about the difference between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation, which is a term or a distinction that you make in your article, Dr. Brown. So on that topic, we would like to hear more about each of your chapters in Soul Thieves. The book covers many different genres related to Black artistry. And so can, you talk a little bit more about your work for our listeners?
Okay, well, great. My co-editor is Baruti Capano, and he is a communications professor at Morgan State University. And he actually came up with the title of Soul Thieves. And it came from Henry Highland Garnett's in his address to the slaves. And in it, he says, "You should use the same manner of resistance as would have been just in our ancestors when the bloody footprints of the first remorseless soul thief was placed upon the shores of our fatherland." And so just as people took our bodies, we were looking at this volume as people taking another form of people of the diaspora. And in this case, the actual soul, which permeates into everything that we do. And we looked at popular culture. In particular, there's an interesting story of how the ideas behind this came to be. So maybe if we have time later, I'll go into that. But we looked at not only appropriation, but we also looked at commodification, as well as misrepresentation. Because in some of the articles, especially like with the fashion and beauty with Abena Lewis Moon and Kimberly Brown, they are looking at ways that people of African descent sometimes become their worst enemy, especially in the beauty ideals, where Kimberly Brown is looking at images of Black women in Black popular and fashion magazines of the 20th century, before Essence. And so in some cases, we are adopting those European standards of beauty. And in other instances, we are fighting those images into something that's more culturally appropriate. Also, again, as you mentioned, we look at a variety of things, sports, music, television, film, and we were just trying to see, this idea, as Dr. Terry was talking about, when people cannot control their own creativity. because Black people create. Black people have been a part of American popular culture and actually drive American popular culture, but are not always credited with it, as is the case with a lot of things in this particular country. And so we wanted to look at and define and present these areas that people of African descent have had a great impact, but also some of the problems that have been attached to them as well. And so we hope that we cover that, not for everything, but in the things that we do present in the volume.
Okay, so if we want to kind of go into some of the work, specifically the articles of Dr. Robertson, potentially?
That's fine. Yes, I continue with the theme. I try to focus more so with music, particularly the notion of hip hop and its role as a resistance or protest dynamic in contemporary culture. I think one thing that's interesting, particularly in terms of hip hop, is this. And as I say this personally, I'm struggling with a generational growth in terms of how things are changing, because it seems as though the most recent generation of hip hop is becoming more difficult to relate to this. Earlier, Dr. Brown mentioned Eminem, and the more recent incarnation of the Eminem is somebody by the name of Post Malone, who apparently has one of the top albums on the hip-hop charts, or Billboard charts rather. And it seems as though, in my view, this is an appropriation situation in the sense that, as we mentioned the topic of power earlier, there's this selective dynamic that in terms of the broader market drifting towards majority artists, and I think we still witness that today in terms of sales, in terms of the power dynamic. But the reason I mentioned the generational thing is that I do think that there's been this revelation in recent years of a newer artist not really being too concerned about, I guess you could say, the history or the foundations of hip-hop. There's been a string of artists, I like to call them the littles, that jokingly say, I don't know or care about who Tupac is and things of this nature. So I'm not sure if that's a generational thing. But in terms of appropriation, I think the reason I mentioned Post Malone is that, as in a contemporary example, I think that's a reflection of more of the appropriation context within the power dynamic in terms of the market still being attracted to people of the majority lean when it comes to hip-hop or music. So that's just more or less a contemporary example in terms of the themes that I try to look at in my chapter. I looked at the relationships between politics and culture and hip-hop, and how there was a apparent decline over the years, evolving from the period of maybe the 1980s when you had the Public Enemy type of groups, and moving through time, and how there seemed to be a decline in the conscious element of hip-hop. And I still think that to a certain degree, outside of quote-unquote underground artists, that there is a more or less decline in that today. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the general things that I tried to look at and flesh out in my essay.
Mm. So yeah, a quick follow-up question to that. I know when the chapter was written at the time, I remember one of the things that you mentioned in the chapter was kind of the positioning of hip-hop during the time. I think it was like number 3 behind country and rock. And today, I believe I saw maybe within the past few months that it has moved up to be number 1 as far as where it's at musically and people consuming and stuff like that, ahead of rock, ahead of country music. Even with that being said, right, and I also, when thinking about this and thinking about appropriation and you have people like Eminem and Macklemore, etc., even Post Malone, who's also interestingly enough, seems to like try to distance himself away from hip hop in many instances too. And so we see that hip hop is being commodified, being digested and consumed at a much higher rate than it was just 4 or 5 years ago. So how do you think, when we talk about appropriation and stuff like that, is there a fine line between it? Because also, like, some of the top hip hop artists, and I remember in the chapter you talk about like people who are conscious or socio-politically engaged, right? And so we see people like the Kendrick Lamars who are, you know, transcending a lot at the top of the game, not really on the same level as the Littles, right? The Littles who seem to have their own kind of following and base, but those who are kind of more mainstream also still have that kind of socio-political message within their music and their lyrics and stuff like that. So I'm trying to be on the fence or teeter the line. Are we feeling like it's being commodified in a way that we're being appropriated? Is it appreciation? Just curious as far as how you're thinking through this current time.
I think it's a gray area, as Dr. Brown was mentioning earlier, but it's also, I think, hip hop and, you know, the role of African Americans or blacks in culture in the United States. And you can even make an argument globally, is unique because it seems like blacks have been the general cultural trendsetter. And in terms of black music as a whole, it's been incorporated in so many elements. I don't know if you can define, have a fine line between genres as much as it before, in the sense that even broader artists are incorporating hip-hop elements, and I don't believe that some, like Post Malone, I find is an interesting case because there's elements of him, like these moments where he wants to almost, he's mocking hip-hop with the gold teeth and the cornrows, but at the same time, you know, he wants to be a rock star-ish type of a figure, but he's obviously, you know, taking from a sort of hip hop base.
Yeah.
To me, that seems more like appropriation, because I think traditionally with majority artists that do or practice more traditional black forms of music, I think there are times when you can tell the people that come across as enthusiasts and general appreciation for the culture, and those who seem as though they're just employing it as a tool or a tactic or a marketing tool to increase their financial position. And I think in the case of people like Post Malone, I view that more of I'm gonna use this image. I'm gonna have gold teeth and I'm gonna braid my hair so I can have a greater success. You know, as opposed to, I do think people like Macklemore are a little more authentic, or even people like Mac Miller, you know, who operate in the traditional, as we used to use the term, backpack hip-hop tradition, where they seem to be enthusiastic and respect the culture to a certain degree. But it is a fine line, and I don't think that you can easily demarcate those who are doing appreciation versus appropriation because of the influence of hip hop. I mean, Ariana Grande is going to rap a little bit in her songs. So it's an interesting context today in terms of the influence of hip hop in general, or black music culture in general. So I think it's difficult to demarcate the two cleanly.
Okay, Dr. Terry, can we hear more about, you know, the history and the evolution of comics and Black superheroes, or the lack thereof?
Oh, yeah, sure. So specifically, I was trying to understand what I call the integration era, or what you might call the implementation of integration era, which is to say, at some point in the 20th century, at least from the mainstream perspective, all of the underlying structures of racial segregation and inequality had been addressed, particularly by federal legislation. And there was a period to see these things put to work and allow these things, again, from that perspective, to have their impact. I define this period roughly from 1966, which is to say after the major civil rights and voting rights legislation, and ending at the election and inauguration of Ronald Reagan, which most would agree saw a tremendous and pointed effort to reverse much of what the civil rights movement was supposedly about. To understand that time period, again, 66 to 1980, I looked at comic books as a cultural artifact, as a sort of chronological effort to test people's opinions sort of real time about the changes that were undergoing. I focused specifically on Marvel Comics just for continuity, and I do so with the understanding that at that point in time, comics, mainstream comics, superhero comics, were largely the voice and instrument of white male middle-class American creators. These were the people who were largely staffing the comic book production and who were the target audience, whose, in other words, the consumers whose responses drove the market, drove the direction of creation. So in that sense, by looking at superhero comics from the 1960s, the 1980s, not just their content in terms of what they did and what they said in their speech bubbles, but also if you're not familiar with comic books at that point in time, and perhaps even still, I'm not sure, but most comics thrived off of reader feedback. They were filled with 2 or 3 pages every issue of letters to the editor, you might call it, where their readers would respond to issues, and you can get a real sense of what people are thinking in terms of their ability to see the comics as a mirror for modern American life. And there are also trade magazines and other sort of industry-related publications that I was able to access to get a sense of what the comic creation, comic consumption audience was thinking about the world in which they were living as that world was interpreted by comic books. I was interested in how these, again, predominantly white-oriented voices interpret the changes of the integration era. How did they speak through particularly the blackness that they constructed, the advent of Black comic book characters, superheroes, comes about in this time. So the blackness they constructed in terms of the characters, the blackness they constructed in terms of the spaces where these characters existed and the things that these characters did and the circumstances that the Black superheroes, as well as the other Black non-superhero or secondary characters that were also created. How did this relay the white male perspective on the changes that had come? You know, when I first constructed this piece, which if you were to look at my CV, this is the one that stands out as not like anything else I had to have done. And the editors, particularly Professor Brown, who I have known since graduate school and probably remembered something of my lingering comic book nerddom in my early 20s when we first met, approached me about contributing this piece. But when I first wrote this piece, I was a bit intimidated that, you know, comic books are so esoteric in terms of a community that I didn't think all the nuances that I was interested in conveying would be conveyed. But thanks, you know, in the last 8 or 9 years to the proliferation of not just superhero movies, but particularly Black characters, you know. So it is a coincidence, but a happy coincidence, that the main Black characters whose development and use and impact that I follow in my piece, Black Panther, Falcon, Storm of the X-Men, Luke Cage, these are the people I write about because those were the, if you will, stars of comic books in terms of Black characters for the period that I'm concerned with. So in the end, I'm grappling with the question and really coming to the conclusion that across this period, what began as an enthusiasm for integration, that the civil rights movement might be sort of seen as separate and apart from the underlying and much longer term Black struggle that produced that movement, the civil rights movement emerged from that struggle when outsiders, when white citizens, white politicians, white business people began to embrace the goals and aims of that movement. And we see an enthusiasm for that type of social justice advocacy in the comic books of the 60s and into the early 70s. But slowly, just as in the real world, and certainly by the time Reagan takes his oath of office, white people, even those who would present themselves as liberal and open-minded, those who were the comic book creator class, as well as many of those who were the readers of comic books, seem perfectly willing to set the enduring problem of race aside and pretend it doesn't exist, or repackage it as some other necessary fact of American life. And we see literally Black people in their struggle left to themselves and their own devices all over again. So.
Yeah, I thought the article was very interesting in how you talked about Storm as a transition from like the focus on, you talked about how characters of the past had a particular worldview that was often informed by, because it was like situated in like a particular context, like neighborhood context, like the ghetto, and how Storm was a transition, and beyond, being from Africa or being brown face, she wasn't necessarily situated as a Black woman. And I also find it interesting that that character, even in the movies recently, there's been actually a lot of controversy because some comic book fans have been upset because increasingly the character has been portrayed by mixed race individuals, and the latest Alexandria Shipp, who is very much like, yes, my mom is white, get over it, type thing. And so there are a lot of people that have been kind of upset about that, but it's interesting that that particular character has not just transitioned. They wasn't situated as Black, but also is transitioned into like, kind of, even in a portrayal of a lighter skinned character. I thought that was interesting.
So, and she's in terms of the main characters whose development and use I explore in this piece, she's really the last to come on the scene in the middle 1970s. So in that way, she speaks both to, if you are familiar with the history of the 1970s, she speaks both to the sort of furtherance and even fulfillment, if you will, of some aspects of civil rights, certainly of Black power, but also the notion of the women's movement and, if you will, affirmative action policies moving to beyond just addressing the legacies of centuries of anti-Black racism, to much more of what became a buzzword at the time, diversity, right? So if the civil rights movement from white Americans' perspectives, and even many of the Black leadership class, if you will, was about integration, proximity, if you will, as opposed to addressing inequality. If the civil rights movement was about that, by the time you get to the mid to late 70s, when Storm is created as a character, the buzzword has become diversity, right? So this notion that if Black people have a problem, then they're just one of many who have common sort of problems. So there is an effort to create a broader field of concern, but ultimately, in pursuit of that broader field, the necessary focus on issues related to African Americans is sort of dropped in place. They're not really completed or brought to a conclusion so much as they are made to compete with sort of other issues. Storm is very much created as a person of color, but she's created in the immigrant mold, someone not born in the United States, very much a departure from approaches to other characters. For example, the first person of color to be a major superhero in the Marvel universe was Black Panther, who of course is from the fictional nation of Wakanda, but his immigrant status is rarely explored prior to the 1970s. In fact, the degree to which he has come to be acculturated in Western ways is really what sort of is held up when issues of his sort of personal character is concerned. So for Storm to be held up as something other than Black, and for Storm to be celebrated and sort of, or at least presented as remarkable for the things about her Blackness that are unlike anything else traditionally associated with Black, was a problem for many readers then, if you read the letters to the editor, and in many ways has continued to be a context with which that character is perceived.
So what are your, really quick question, what are your thoughts about how things are being viewed now? Again, similar to Dr. Robertson's piece and a lot of pieces, right? A lot of this stuff was just, I feel like the things you wrote were just before this kind of explosion of things like hip hop. And then of course, what we see today when it comes to Black comic book representation being represented now on TV and on film, like Black Panther, which was a huge success. But we're also seeing things like the Netflix series Luke Cage. We're also seeing this the show on Black Lightning as well. That's on regular television and stuff like that. And also the integration within Black characters, Black writers. I know, like with Spider-Man, there was conversations about a new character like Miles Morales, and the new Iron Man being a young woman of color. Ta-Nehisi Coates writing one of the more recent arcs of Black Panther as well. So that's also like Black writers trying to contribute to this conversation of Black representation within the comic book world. So what would be your thoughts on the more contemporary aspects of what we're seeing within Black superheroes today, kind of versus what we saw when you centered your piece around right after the civil rights movement?
Sure. Well, my first reaction to that question is that what we see in terms of how these things are being presented, I believe future historians will see this as part of the broader effort, if you will, to appear to be embracing wider audiences and speaking to communities that are less than represented, if you will. Now, is that an effort of commoditization? Is it sort of crass marketing, or is it sort of sincere efforts to approach that topic? And I think there is a difference between other media, movies and television, and the print media of comic books, because although I'm not as in tune to the modern comic book reading scene, I have two teenagers, and they read some, but not as much as certainly I did when I was a young boy. But suffice it to say, even Coates, as successful and celebrated as his career has been, as he has attempted to broaden, for example, the number of publications, the number of titles that deal with Black Panther and or Wakanda-related issues, the public that buys comic books, not goes to movies or watches television, but buys comic books, is still predominantly white and male. And many of the market, it seems, just as it did in the 70s and 80s, will only support so many Black-centered titles, not because they are overly concerned with ideas that we might say are related to Blackness, but just because the face of the character is Black, and the same would go gender-wise. As much as we might say strides have been made in making comics more gender sensitive and more sensitive of sexual orientations, the comics that sell the most, the characters that get multiple titles and have those titles sustained, even sometimes despite readership numbers, have those titles sustained, are principally comics which are white, male-centered. So I think there is a great difference in regard to the different platforms, the media platforms, but in terms of the comic book industry itself, it's still as difficult as it was before, in many ways, for Black creators to get a position to create what they want relative to what they have been able to prove as a group they're able to produce. And it's still difficult for Black characters to have sustained runs in terms of their titles existing for more than a few issues.
Yeah, that was awesome. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add, Dr. Brown. I know as I was reading your article, one thing that stuck out to me, you used this phrase called purposeful dishonesty when you talked about appropriation, and particularly when it came to the origins of Black dance, especially when popular white culture tried to appropriate it. So do you want to talk a little bit more about your chapter?
Sure. I do want to say that I haven't checked the statistics on Amazon lately, but Dr. Robertson's and Dr. Terry's chapters, because, you know, people don't always buy the entire work now and they can download chapters. They were 2 of the 3 most downloaded chapters on Amazon from the book. This, I was sitting here listening to them. I mean, I've obviously read their pieces. I know them, I know their research, but I was still riveted as you all were talking, and you know how I am. So I did my best not to, you know, make my own commentary as you were going on about your wonderful research that's part of this work. So thank you so much. That purposeful dishonesty. That goes along with the things that we were talking about, specifically with this idea that we present throughout the volume of cultural capital, and the idea that there is a money-making incentive with popular culture. Black people generally supply the creativity, and mainstream America and the people in charge of that, the moneyed folks, trying to be politically correct, reap the monetary benefits from it. And we see this over and over in the subjects that are discussed throughout the work. I think you may be talking about with swing dance in particular, and the Lindy Hop, and how the actor that played the Tin Man in the original Wizard of Oz attempted to say that he was the person who created the dance. He was not. The dance was created at the Savoy, Harlem nightclub. And just as the same things that we're talking about today, back in the 1920s, when the club opens, Norma Miller, who's a very famous, well, she's famous in the dance world, but not famous like she really should be. She talks about how, like with swing dance in particular, they tried to keep their rhythms very, very fast because you had white people who were going to the clubs at that time, you know, and she said they wanted to keep those rhythms fast. They wanted to keep those dance steps fast so that others couldn't steal them. And today, in thinking about the work and in thinking about maybe some other areas of research that I might want to document, there is this idea of, you know, adopt and adapt, this idea of the supposing melding of cultures, but they still exist in that power dynamic that we talked about in the beginning. And in the United States of America, for example, we have this idea of, you know, that you learn from elementary school, of this melting pot, because we have this idea of assimilation, assimilating into the mainstream culture, so that you don't have a pluralistic society where different cultures, you know, maintain some of that authenticity that makes them, you know, who and what they are. And that idea of assimilating, it's a power. It's this power struggle, this power dynamic, because if you assimilate into this larger, broader society, then you become, to a certain extent, that image that the powers that be want to portray. So I titled my piece, So You Think You Can Dance, okay, I watch the show. I'm a dancer. Well, my evil twin is. Anyway, so I watch the show, and overall, because I struggle with this, there are very few outlets and opportunities for dancers in general and for people of color in dance specifically. So I think the show is good in that it helps to generate an audience for dance. And I remember reading several years ago, like they had this job listings thing and they had dancer down as a job that would be obsolete. Now, I'm talking about a trained dancer, not an exotic dancer. I'm not judging, but I'm just saying, okay? So, and I thought that was horrible, as somebody who has enjoyed the field my entire life. And who still, dabbles in it. And I was like, wow. And so I think that it's a good platform. Jennifer Lopez has a new show out, World of Dance. I think all these things are good platforms to broaden the audience and keep dance viable. Because dance and music and these other parts of popular culture, that's what defines a people. So I do title my portion of the work that I talked about at the one part in my submission. I talked about a gentleman on So You Think You Can Dance in one of the very first seasons, and he was a hip hop dancer, and the judges often had such horrible things to say about him because he wasn't trained in the other dance forms. Typically, you have to be a contemporary dancer to really make it far. Now, they have had some hip hop dancers win the competition because they started to bill it as America's favorite dancer. And so it's this idea of, you have to be able to translate your dance into these various styles and things like that and be able to pick those up. And so people who train in all these different forms, they do have an advantage. You see that every season. They do have an advantage, but they just kept going in. And if you had, if the judges picked you, to be sent home that week, then you had to basically dance for your life. And I talked about how he was dancing for his life and, how some of the judges were critiquing him, some of the judges who actually work as choreographers. And they couldn't do the stuff that he was doing. I don't even think that they could imagine doing the stuff that he was doing and translating his particular dance style into choreography for the stage of, many of the pop artists or whomever that they choreograph for. And so that was very interesting to me. Also, MTV had America's Best Dance Crew. And the Jabberwockies won over a group from Boston called Status Quo. And Status Quo, they had heart and they had talent. I don't think any of these young men had ever, stuck a toe in anybody's dance studio. Their studio, was where they lived, outside. Okay. And the things that they came up with on that season, I thought were incredible. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the Jabberwockies because the Jabberwockies won. I know that they had a residency in Las Vegas. They had commercial deals and things like this that they got from the notoriety from winning the show, et cetera. But when you would go online to see the comments that people were writing about them, and this goes back to some of the things that Dr. Robertson was saying about hip hop music, because this was hip hop dance. So the Jabberwockies, many of them had Asian American background. And in interviews, they were talking about this idea of assimilation. They were talking about, oh, well, yes, we have these backgrounds, but we're American now. Now, interestingly enough, the way that they translated their lives into being American was through hip hop. And hip hop came from where? It came from the South Bronx, with Black folk and Latinos. Okay. And so they were relating this idea of being American. And there was another group that was on that season. They were called Kaba Modern, and they were an Asian group as well. And some of the fans were arguing that the judges put status quo in the finals so that you wouldn't have a final with two Asian American dance crews. Now, these are supposedly fans of hip hop, supposedly fans of hip hop dance, and they were citing things like reverse racism and all this other kind of stuff. I found that to be quite interesting, as well as problematic, as you know, also. Now, we were talking about things like cultural appreciation and that type of stuff. Now, in hip hop dance, a big component would be the martial arts films of the 1970s. And so those early, crews and those early dancers, they did get some of their, moves and things from that type of popular cultural form. So I find it really interesting, this dynamic that happens when race becomes involved. And that adoption, the fusion that happens, because people weren't necessarily, a lot of people did not denigrate the Jabberwockies for winning, but they did talk about status quo and the lack of opportunities that status quo had versus, some of the other groups, and how they were able to get that far, and that their representation was like a non-theatrical type of representation of real kind of street hip hop dance. Again, very interesting. And then another, I know we've taken up a lot of time, so I just wanted to mention another thing that I explore, which is stepping. Stepping in the form of African-American Greek sororities and fraternities. And in this area, we call it the DMV. So it's the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. In our high schools, we actually have step teams in many of the high schools, and they have these large competitions. The step teams were formed typically by, members of Black Greek sororities and fraternities in many of the pockets I know in Northern Virginia, where you don't have a large demographic of African Americans. And so like that small minority of Black kids that were in that school, they wanted to do something to help them in that environment that they were in, et cetera. So they formed these teams. Well, of course, Black culture is popular. It always has been. And so you have all these other ethnicities and everything that started to join these teams. And they didn't join it because of the history of where stepping came from and how it's related to the organizations and things like that. They joined it because it was what? It was cool. Okay, because there's that big cool factor that is through Black popular culture as well. So I say, this is a high school thing that happens around here. But of course, any college campus, you will have a competition. And in 2010, I believe it was the Sprite National Competition, and a white sorority from, I believe it was the University of Arkansas, won. And there was a huge controversy about that. And it just exemplifies a lot of the things that we do have in the book, in that they had learned this on their campus because they had a Greek unity night. So with the idea of sharing, okay, the Black sororities, taught them some of their steps probably, or taught them, how to create a step. And they thought that they, were good enough to make it to this national competition, and they were. And now let me clarify that. There has to be, there's the fascination factor. Black audiences are often flattered when somebody else, the other, comes and, performs really well in that style. or whatever that may be. They are often flattered. And that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing. Again, we talk about this idea of appreciation. It's a bad thing because we just give our culture away. We do. And that's where we talk about this idea of misrepresentation, the authentic factor of it. Because if a person like Ray Bolger, says, oh, I invented the Lindy Hop, completely out of context, but it goes down because it is written down. And it goes down as the historical record, that is a problem. And I don't know, especially like with the internet and things, because now, of course, you don't have to, it's like the Cotton Club in the 1920s. You can go there, you can watch these Black people perform, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need to sit next to them because they're not allowed in the audience. They're the performers and the staff. And the internet's, very similar in that, okay, well, you can become a voyeur and you can, get all these aspects of African-American popular culture and you can appropriate them and you can do whatever and you can be Kylie Jenner and you can become, a billionaire. You can keep that in there. But I mean, these are just some of the things that we address. I know that we're still looking for answers. I know that this has encouraged me to continue looking for answers. I also wanted to thank both of you for reading the book. This is the first interview that we've had about it.
We appreciate it. We appreciate the content in the book and you guys taking out the time to come speak with us about, soul thieves. I think it's a really important topic, especially in the midst of everything that's going on today with just the kind of just mass emergence of Black popular culture. And a lot more of these conversations are being had, within the academic settings, but also just within the general public as well and at people's dinner tables as far as a lot of the topics we talk about, definitely with hip hop, definitely with comic books, definitely with things like dance and music and culture as well. We feel like they're all very important topics. And we appreciate you all with, your insights and having the academic rigor to research and write about this. And, we understand that the world of academia isn't always the most welcoming place to content focused on people of color for a lot of reasons. So we definitely appreciate all that you do. With that being said, is there any place where people can find you? Are you all on social media at all? Email, websites, if people wanted to contact you?
I'm not really on social media.
Okay. I
mean, they can contact. How did you all find us anyway? I mean, they can contact me if they would like. They can contact me through my Bowie State email address. I do answer as long as it's, something serious. Okay. I do answer.
No worries.
I can say that if you want to check out any of these dances, definitely Google them because I came across some interesting historical dance videos that were related to your article. So yeah, that was really good.
When I do, if I do presentations at conferences, I'll bring the video footage.
Nice.
Yeah, one of the areas that I really liked, but I didn't have time was the Soul Train part. That was a part of my youth. I'm sure Dr. Terry and Dr. Robertson have their Soul Train stories as well. But that was, that's one of my favorite parts of the work. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Dr. Uhura Williams. He was one of the editors of the series at Palgrave, he along with Peniel Joseph. Initially, it was Dr. Joseph and Manning Marable before he passed. And then Dr. Williams came along and he was the one, because he remembered my interest in popular culture. And so he was the one that helped get this book out. So I do have to always thank him for that.
All right, any closing words from Dr. Terry or Dr. Robertson?
Just appreciate the time and the opportunity.
No, again, just thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, Dad, so what do you think about our guest coming on to talk about Soul Thieves? How you feeling?
I thought it was really good. Like, so they all focused on different aspects of Black artistry. And so it was interesting just to have a conversation about all three of them, like the references that they made, especially, you know, related to So You Think You Can Dance, you know, America's Best Dance Crew, even the conversation about Storm. It was all so interesting. I can't believe that is someone's work. They get to do that.
That's cool. That, you know, again, we've said this plenty of times on this podcast that when there is, you know, areas of that interest you specifically, you can do in academia, and we're bringing tons and tons of people on here who are examples of that. So that was pretty cool. And yeah,
I might switch my research interest to food because I really like food. So maybe I can like eat a bunch of stuff.
Eat a bunch of stuff and write reviews, blogs. I mean, you can always do a blog on that. You can do some episodes. Yeah. We haven't did an episode on anything food related, have we?
No, we haven't.
That'll be a good one. Maybe a nutritionist or dietitian or just, you know, food in general. I know somebody's probably doing research on culture and foods, which would probably be cool. So yeah, well, that's a good one. Yes,
well, you know, the Kardashians be trying to culturally appropriate Southern food. They always like cooking like fried chicken and like macaroni and cheese and like taking Instagram photos of it to show how down they are. Like
they are sick. we know that food had no soul in it. No soul and no seasoning. So don't even try to fool it. Man.
What was your take on it?
Oh, I enjoyed it. You know, I mean, the book, we only covered, you know, the guests we had on, you know, only with just 3 chapters in the book. And I think there's about 10 or 11 chapters that all dive into different aspects of it. So, you know, we kind of only hit the tip of the iceberg with it. But, you know, like she said, Dr. Terry and Dr. Robertson, their chapters were some of the most downloaded. I mean, it makes sense dealing with comic books and dealing with hip hop. You know, when we talk about appropriation, but dance as well. When she talked about the Jabberwockies, I remember that season. I was all into it, against Status Quo. Status Quo, they were the kids, the Black guys, right? Who were doing like the arm breaking kind of moves, I think. Or was that a different season?
I can't recall. I just remember Jabberwockies because they took over everything.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Jabberwockies was everywhere.
Yeah.
That was a fun season. But yeah, beyond that, stepping and all that kind of stuff, you know, it was really good and really interesting. And how, like I said, in the interview, they kind of wrote a lot of this stuff before this wave of mass Blackness in popular culture and media. So it was good to get their take on how they feel about what's going on now. More present take on that too.
So what did you think about, you know, like the conversation about like whether appropriation can work the other way around? What was your take on that?
I think that's important, you know, take on that, because it's similar to when we hear things like reverse racism, right? I think the part they highlighted was that power plays a integral role as far as appropriation as well in all these dynamics, especially dealing with race and all the other isms we talk about in this country. And so, can it happen the other way around? Of course, cultures share and influence one another. But predominantly in this country, I think most of the culture has been taken and stolen from oppressed peoples. And we see that in a lot of other ways. So that power dynamic of, what are we taking from the majority and what can happen? You know, I think it's different. I don't think it's appropriating because the power as far as how we can use it or not use it or claim it and commodify it and make it consumable. We just don't have that, right? Compared to the majority who has the power to actually take something from your culture and say it's ours or take credit for it and make money off it or do whatever. That's a completely different ball game. And I think that's a key component. So yeah. How about you? What do you think about that?
No, I was about to say where you said take credit for it. And I think that is my biggest thing. And I think when we talk about like how can we fix the issue, because I do like cultural exchanges. I think it's a great thing, but I don't ever want to look at an online magazine article or get on Twitter and some large popular culture forum such as like Vogue or something like that is attributing something that is uniquely Black to others. Don't do that. It kind of makes me think of our conversation with Professor Onwachiwilleg and Professor Green about hair and how braids were attributed to what do you call that? Bo Derek braids or something like that, and how it was reinvented by Kylie Jenner or whatnot. Like, no, don't do that, because those same braids can get us fired, but get you celebrated. So I think it is more about acknowledging the origins of certain things and giving credit where credit is due. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
that's me.
And even when they talked about like different hip hop, white hip hop artists, I think this whole thing of people like Macklemore and them, and even Eminem, they give credit like, hey, hip hop wasn't created by white folk. They pay homage to the black predecessors, right? Hey, this is an art form that I appreciate, I love, I use, but it's not mine. And usually they're pretty careful as far as recognizing that. I think this is why they're more so widely accepted in that particular culture, in that realm, because it's not like I'm taking it and claiming it as mine and I'm reinventing it in this way. While yes, there's been a lot of backlash for somebody like Post Malone, who has clearly used hip hop to propel himself to where he is today, but always wants to distance himself from hip hop and talk about hip hop artists and lyrics and how people don't really rap and all this other kind of stuff. But yet all your beats and all the lyrics and the features you have are hip hop based. So, paying attention to how people are being received and promoted in a lot of different ways is interesting too, when they had that whole conversation about being appropriated.
Yeah. But overall, I think it's an important topic to talk about because, like I said, it has been a buzzword on social media for the last few years. And it was just something I wanted to, talk about. And like I said, I'm just really happy the conversation about power dynamics and why we not going to turn cultural appropriation into reverse racism.
Yeah, we're not
like you just said.
We ain't doing that. And it's like, even during the interview, I was thinking about how where we are today, and we see this mass emergence of Black popular culture in pretty much every way you turn, from music to TV to movies, just everything. And a part of it is like within the community, it's just like a mass amount of celebration and we appreciate what's going on. But then in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking like, is this happening for the right reasons, right? Is it here to stay because the world has finally realized like Blacks need more representation? Or on the flip side, when we see the success of things like Black Panther, right, making $1 billion, is it like, oh, well, this is a moneymaker for us now. We're going to just continue to do it until it stops making us money, and then we won't care for it as much. And so that's the kind of weird limbo. We do have, the Black directors and the Black writers and the actors and the filmmakers all incorporating this, but it's like the big seat at the table. Are we there yet where it's going to sustain? Yeah. And I feel like those people are like, oh, this is making us money. One movie, $1 billion. Okay, let's do it again. But what happens if it just brings us $50 million? Will we see another one? So it's like appropriation, appreciation, celebration, all these things kind of intertwine. And it's like, where will we be 10 years from now when this kind of situation?
I agree. Because thinking about like in the 90s, there were a lot of Black TV, a lot of Black sitcoms, and then it kind of disappeared for a long time. Yeah. And now it's back. And I don't want this to be a cycle. Like, can we just continue it now? And like you said, move the conversations beyond like, oh, Black people are more profitable than I thought. Yeah. And it being like, no, this is just really good. They have talent. And this is just something we should do. Yeah. So I agree.
So this is why people who I pay attention to, people like Jay-Z, who are really taking ownership in a lot of the stakes, things like Tidal, where you're trying to compete with other brands like, of course, Apple Music, which is one of the top out there, but really taking ownership with our own artistry and what we give to the world makes it so that we can also control it. Because that's the thing when we talk about how can we fix this or how should it be addressed. Dr. Brown briefly mentioned it, is the fact that she felt that we gave our stuff away too easily. And so, okay, I'm a big artist and I'm just going to give my stuff to Apple Music and they're going to make all this money off of me. And then when I'm not selling number ones, they're going to kick me to the side. Versus if you were working maybe with somebody like a Jay-Z who understands the artistry, but also the culture and Blackness, will work with you longer, work for you better, and we have control of our own kind of how we commodify certain stuff in our own culture. So I think that does play a role. But yeah, good conversation nonetheless. Well, as always, continue to review and rate us on iTunes, be Black and Highly Dangerous. Email us at bhdpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us at BHD Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Share us with everybody. Share us with your friends, your family, your enemies, like we always say. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.